This is not the Miyoo Mini Plus. This is the R33S, a brand new Miyoo Mini Plus clone that actually is cheaper than the Miyoo Mini Plus and even more powerful than the Miyoo Mini Plus. And I've been so excited about the R33S and chomping at the bit to get my hands on one ever since I saw the leaks a few months back, and finally I have one in my hands and we can check it out together. So taking it out of the box, we can see we have the handheld itself, of course, which we're going to take a look at in a second. We have a charger and the manual, and that's pretty much it. So we don't need to focus too much on all that. What everyone wants to see is the handheld, the R33S. So you can see I chose the transparent purple model, which I really like the look of, but it does have a few other color choices that are available. And you can see a few of the color options on the side of the box, and I'm pretty sure there actually are some other options that aren't listed here because I've seen some photos of ones that seem different than this, especially this all white model with all white buttons, which looks super clean, and I hope they actually do end up releasing. And now looking at the front of the handheld, we have the ABXY button. So I actually love the buttons here on the R33S. They definitely feel different than how they did on the R36S, which is a good thing because the R36S buttons weren't the best buttons I've ever felt in the world. They're not absolutely perfect. Sometimes if you press the B button very lightly, it won't register that you're pressing it, but for most normal use, everything is still pretty good. But these feel great and get the job done well. And we also have our D-pad, and the D-pad is actually surprisingly decent. It's not the best D-pad I've ever felt in my life, but it's also by no means the worst. A lot of people with these clone devices expect something awful because you can look back at something like the R35S, and the D-pad that came with that was just so stiff and it was so bad, and some people were even doing modifications to try to slightly improve it. But with the R33S, I would say you don't need to attempt to do any of that. To me, it's completely fine and escapes all the pitfalls that often plague these cheaper handhelds. So overall, I'm pretty happy with it. Then we have the start and select buttons down here, and one thing that I'm not super in love with is the reset button here in the middle of the front of the handheld. I mean, it's fine. I don't anticipate accidentally pressing it or anything like that. It's just a feature that I wish wasn't here, and I kind of would prefer it to be on the side of the handheld, but it's not the end of the world. Then we have our volume buttons, 2 USB-C ports, a headphone jack, 2 micro SD card slots, which is an improvement from the Miyoo Mini Plus, which only has 1, and we have a power button up top, and lastly we have our R1, R2, L1, L2 shoulder buttons, which have the slightly elevated design. I'm not sure if there's a specific name for this, but it's super comfortable. The buttons themselves are fine. They're kind of clicky, so some people prefer that, some people don't. They're a bit loud, but nothing super ridiculous. You can see we also have a more easily removable battery, which I'm always a fan of. And while I'm turning on the R33S, you can see there's a few areas where this handheld did deviate from the Miyoo Mini Plus's design, and there's actually some copyright problems going on behind the scenes, which I'll talk about later in this video. So it's not exactly a one-to-one clone of the Miyoo Mini Plus. I'm not going to go over everything because there's probably some stuff that I missed, but there are some things that are somewhat more prominent. But honestly, to the untrained eye, the R33S could easily be mistaken for a Miyoo Mini Plus, and I think that was clearly intentional. So as you can see, we have ArcOS here on the R33S, and I'll just give you a quick overview of ArcOS before I get into the gameplay because I know that's what a lot of people really care about. So we have all of our consoles here, select the one that you want, and then you have all your games, select it, and then it'll start playing. And it's really as simple as that. You have other options. For example, you have the option to change the appearance pretty significantly actually. So there's a lot of different ways that ArcOS can look and make it non-recognizable, so you might have seen it with a different appearance setting than the one I have on now, but there's a ton of them out there and you can pick your favorite. And there's a lot of other features that ArcOS has, but I'm not going to go over everything here, and there's other resources that give you a much more detailed guide that even I could here. So anyway, let's get right into the gameplay. So first we have all of the lower end stuff. All of this should not be surprising that it'll run on the R33S. We have stuff like Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, NES, SNES. There's really no doubts that all of this will run fine without any problems on the R33S because this handheld is an RK3326 device, just like the R36S was, or the R35S I believe was as well, and there's tons of other RK3326 handhelds out there, so it shouldn't be too surprising what this thing can and can't run. So everything under PS1 will run fine, and of course we can do even stuff above that. So speaking of that, let's get into PS1 emulation. So really, like I said, for the stuff under PS1, everything will run well, and same with the PS1. Every PlayStation 1 game that I tested, and I think basically every single PS1 game will run great with no problems. You can even increase the resolution on certain games. I'm not going to say it'll be great for every single PlayStation 1 game, game, but quite a few, and pretty much everything I tested worked well the majority of the time. There might be some games with an enhanced resolution that won't be the best or might have the occasional slowdown, but I think it's a feature that you can use in a lot of PlayStation 1 games, and if that's something you care about, you can do it here, and on some similar budget devices in this price range, you can't. So that's a big plus for the R33S. And then we have Nintendo DS. So Nintendo DS games work great on the R33S. Of course, you're going to have the same problems that you will with any retro handheld. Some games will be a little touchscreen heavy and won't work the best on a retro handheld without a touchscreen, and especially with the R33S, you don't even have an analog stick to emulate a stylus, so it can be a little bit more awkward at times. But there's many Nintendo DS games that don't require too much touchscreen use, and they work great on here. And then we have N64. So first off, it's best to change the emulator in your settings for the Nintendo 64 to get best performance. It might differ, but you're certainly going to be getting better performance in all the games that I tested if you change it to this emulator, so make sure to do that first. And unfortunately, right here we run into a problem. So when you open up an N64 game, you can see that they do work, and there is an improvement using this new emulator, but unfortunately, we don't have an analog stick here on the R33S. So when trying to use the D-pad, it just doesn't work to move. So there are some N64 games that don't require the use of an analog stick from what I understand, but most of them do, and trying to play a game here like Super Mario 64, it's just not working whatsoever. So because this is kind of a first look video, and I want to get this video out quick because I know a lot of people are having questions about the R33S, and I was able to get it before most other people. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time trying to troubleshoot this. I looked into it a bit, and I couldn't figure out how to get into the settings and maybe mess around with it in these standalone emulators, so I'll just say there's other RK3326 handhelds like the R33S has, like the R36S, which has the exact same performance in N64 as we will here, and it can play a lot of N64 games. The easier to run games will be good, the ones more in the middle will work sometimes, not the absolute best performance. You will get some slowdowns here and there, but many of the mid-tier games will be playable most of the time, but there still will be some higher end stuff that's out of reach. And I also did encounter this problem where we couldn't move on certain Dreamcast games and certain PSP games, although it was much less widespread than it is here on the N64. So just keep that in mind if you know of a solution for trying to mess around with this with these standalone emulators, because I know it'd probably be easier in the RetroArch emulators, but with these standalone emulators that do have better performance, I'm not exactly sure how, and I wanted to get the video out ASAP, so I'm just going to leave this as is, and if you know, leave a comment down below, and then also check the comments if you're curious. And then there's Dreamcast. So Dreamcast works pretty good most of the time. I'm sure there's some harder to emulate games that aren't going to work well, but for the ones that I tested, you get pretty good performance most of the time. In certain games, like racing games for example, Crazy Taxi 2, there's going to be certain points in the map or on the track where there will be a bit of slowdown and it's not running perfect, but for most of the time these games are completely playable, and again, you just have to use common sense. If it's something that's notoriously hard to emulate, yeah, it's probably not going to be the greatest on here, but for lighter games and stuff in the middle, I would say they're going to be playable the majority of the time. And then we have PSP. So PlayStation Portable emulation is really pushing it on the R33S. There are some lighter, easier to emulate games that will work on here, but when you get into heavier, more 3D based games, don't be too surprised if they're not playable. I would expect more lighter stuff, platformers, maybe some RPGs, stuff like that to be able to run good on here, but probably for most PSP games it's not going to be super great. And one thing I have to say about the emulation on here is that it all looks super great on the screen. I really love the screen that's been used in these handhelds. The same one I think is used here as was used on the R36S, and it looks really good. I think you could make a case that it's better than the one you'd find on the Miyoo Mini Plus, for example. I'm not doing a side-by-side comparison here. Maybe in the future I will actually do one of those if there's enough of a demand for it. I'm not one of those people that know the exact words to use for every aspect of these displays, but just from an average consumer perspective, it looks really good. And with the battery life, you're going to be getting anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. I believe that's what they advertised it as, and I would say that's about right. If you're sitting around playing something heavier like PlayStation 1 in enhanced resolution or Dreamcast, I would expect probably to get more around 4 than 6, but with some lighter weight stuff, I would say yeah, maybe 6 hours is more realistic. Somewhere between 4 and 6 I would expect. And then there's Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So I haven't tested this extensively, so I'm not going to make any definitive statements here, but notoriously with this line of handhelds, the R35S, the R36S, and now the R33S, the Miyoo Mini Plus clone, there have always been problems with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi. And with the Bluetooth, I don't even think there is Bluetooth on this. It was advertised on the box as having Bluetooth, but I think we've all learned by now not to trust the descriptions after seeing $50 handhelds on AliExpress that can emulate PlayStation 3. We shouldn't trust everything that these companies have to say. So I'm pretty sure there is no Bluetooth on here. At least I couldn't get anything working. Then there's Wi-Fi. So if you want to use Wi-Fi on here, there is not built-in Wi-Fi from what I can tell. I haven't torn it apart and tried to look for anything, but it hasn't worked for me, and that was the case with the R33S as well. So if you want to test out the Wi-Fi, you need to use a dongle, and you should tread carefully if you do decide to do that, because I know some people have had problems with it just not working at all, maybe initially showing the networks but then not working later on. So if you absolutely need something that has Wi-Fi, I won't make any guarantees for this, and there are some devices that are close to this price and maybe a bit more expensive that do have Wi-Fi. So if it's an essential for you, maybe go that route. And even if it would end up working, who wants to be using a dongle? I don't even like saying the word, so having to use one constantly and not just having it built in is an annoyance. So there is that. There's other things to keep in mind. For me, and I would say for most people, ArcOS is fine, but there are some features that people absolutely love with the actual Miyoo Mini Plus. They love Onion OS, they love the features that come with it, and there's always a few others to consider. Again, this isn't a Miyoo Mini Plus versus R33S video. Maybe in the future I will do one, so I'm not going to go in depth with everything, but you can always just consider your options. I don't know exactly what you need, so I'm not going to say, yes, the R33S is better than the Miyoo Mini Plus, even though in many ways, for me, I think it is. And here's why. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the R33S is going to be cheaper than the Miyoo Mini Plus. There are some problems with supply and price right now that I'll mention in a minute, but it seems like it's going to be selling for around $40 and maybe even possibly less than that. We see the R36S often being like $35, $36, $37, somewhere in there on AliExpress, especially with constant sales. You probably could get it in the upper $30 range, so that's cheaper than you're generally going to be finding Miyoo Mini Pluses for. Of course, it is more powerful than the Miyoo Mini Plus. With custom firmware, you can try to play some of the consoles that this can emulate, but it won't be as good as what you'll get on the R33S. So there is more power, it is cheaper, but you're not going to be getting that authentic Miyoo Mini Plus experience. You're not going to be able to put Onion OS on here, so that's important to you. Yeah, you're not going to be getting it. And I know some people just absolutely love the Miyoo Mini Plus community. They love Onion OS. They love everything surrounding it, so you might be missing out if you decide to get the clone. But personally, I really love the R33S, and it's not just merely a cheap clone. I actually think it's a super good handheld. Some people don't feel the same way. I've seen some people say, yeah, it feels kind of dirty, it feels kind of sleazy that they're making all these really exact, nearly one-to-one clones. I'm not going to say it's one-to-one because there are some differences, and I don't fully agree with that way of thinking. I mean, no one would like their design being cloned, but the retro handheld industry really is just an industry where you steal stuff, you copy ideas, you clone. I mean, look what's loaded onto a lot of the micro SD cards that you get with these handhelds. I mean, you kind of forfeit a lot of your right to be able to say, hey, you copied me, when you're putting what you're putting on these micro SD cards as these companies. So there's a bit of controversy behind these handhelds, and of course Miyoo is not super happy about the R33S, and that's why there are some, at the time of me recording this, supply problems with the R33S. Now, I was able to get my hands on one, and I'm going to have a link down below in the description which you can use to check the prices, and in the pinned comment as well. I'll try to get you guys the cheapest listing down there, but the rumors are, at the time of me recording this, in the future it may change and may fall through, but it seems that Miyoo is trying to keep the R33S off of AliExpress and probably similar sites, because of course it's going to cut into their profits, and they're afraid people are going to start buying this instead of the Miyoo Mini Plus, and obviously they wouldn't like that, so they're trying to stop it. And we saw a similar thing with the R35S a few months back, and then instead of the R35S, they basically took that off of the shelves and then started selling the R36S, which just had a few differences. You know, they had the analog sticks on the bottom of the device instead of the top, and it was still somewhat of a clone device, but it was different enough that they were still able to sell it, and there was no claim, you know, hey, this is a direct copy of our design, you can't sell this, it's infringing on our copyright or whatever else. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the correct terms to use. So it might be the case that going forward, in order to sell the R33S, they're going to have to make a few different, probably cosmetic changes to this handheld in order to have it on AliExpress and make it able to be sold to a wider audience, because you can't buy them now. At the time of me recording this, again, check the link in the description or in the pinned comment if you want a more up-to-date price. But right now, it's harder to find them for good prices. The ones that I can find are not $40, they're a bit more expensive than that. Some random Filipino website started selling them about 2 weeks ago for some reason. I'm not really sure how they got their hands on them. Some found their way onto Amazon, and there's some other wholesale websites that do have them, but they're by no means, at the time of me recording this, as widely available as a handheld like the R36S, which is basically going to have the same performance. So honestly, I'm really here for all these clone devices. There's so many out now, and you might have some problems with it, but to me, me, I really think that it gives the consumer a better experience, it gives all of us more options, and even more powerful handhelds for cheaper prices, and I would say overall that's a good thing. The only problem is with all these clone handhelds, it does kind of make it a tough decision. For example, we have the R36S, which is basically the same hardware as this R33S, but it has analog sticks, and there's positives, there's negatives. I like the shoulder buttons here more than those on the R36S, and I like the buttons here more than those on the R36S, but I like the analog sticks more that you have on the R36S because you don't have any here. So there's all these differences, all these clone devices, and honestly, it's a little bit confusing if you're a new buyer, but as someone who likes to review these and collect these, I love all the different variations, and I'm having a ton of fun with it, and I hope even more come out in the future. So anyway, guys, if you do decide to buy this, I'd appreciate it if you use my link down in the description. At some point, I may put an affiliate link down there, which comes at no extra cost to you, but does help support my channel, throw some change my way, and makes it so I'm able to do more reviews just like this one. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.